I've known Paul and Kenneth long enough to stop remembering when it started. We didn't plan these trips. They just happened. One message, a loose idea, and suddenly we were hours from home, chasing the same feeling we always chased. We trusted each other in ways that didn't need to be spoken. If one of us said it was safe, that was enough. If one of us said it was time to leave, we listened. That kind of trust only comes from surviving stupid decisions together. By the time we reached the cave, it already felt like just another story we'd laugh about later. People like to imagine explorers as quiet, serious types, focused, careful. We weren't. Paul was already complaining before we even reached the cave entrance, dragging his boots through loose gravel like he wanted the mountain to hear him suffering. "You know," he said, stopping to adjust his pack, "normal people get adrenaline from skydiving or racing cars, not crawling into places that have been trying to collapse for 1,000 years." Kenneth laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. "You say that every time, and every time I'm right," Paul shot back. "One of these days, the cave's gonna win." I remember smiling as I watched them. The sound of their voices bounced lightly off the rock walls, familiar and comforting. That was the part I liked most. Not just the exploration, but the shared stupidity of it. The cave entrance itself was unimpressive. A narrow opening tucked into a jagged slope and half hidden by shadow. There was no cold air spilling out, no dramatic drop-off, just darkness. Kenneth leaned in, shining his headlamp inside. "Unmapped," he said, grinning. "You realize how rare that is now?" "If it was safe," I said. "Someone would have already tagged it online." Paul snorted. "Great. Famous last words." We checked our gear out of habit, more than necessity: lights, backups, tethers, helmets. Paul made a show of knocking his helmet against mine. "If we die," he said, "I want it on record that this was your idea, Ted." "Noted," I said. "But if we find something incredible, you're taking credit." "Obviously." The first stretch inside was easy, wide enough to stand upright with dry stone beneath our boots. Our lights carved shallow tunnels through the dark, revealing nothing but rock. Kenneth narrated, like we were filming a documentary no one asked for. Paul exaggerated every sound, gasping dramatically whenever a shadow shifted. At one point, Paul flicked his headlamp off just to mess with us. "Relax," he said, laughing in the dark. "You trust me, right?" I told him to turn it back on. He did, and for a while longer, everything stayed normal. We moved deeper, still talking, still joking, and none of us noticed when the echoes started sounding wrong. It happened gradually, voices lingering too long. Footsteps coming back slightly delayed, as if the cave needed time to decide how to respond. The walls narrowed, not sharply, just enough to make us walk single file. That's when Kenneth slowed down and lowered his light. "Hey," he said, "these weren't here before, right?" Paul leaned closer to the wall. "Those aren't scratches," he said. "They're drawings. They were etched directly into the stone, with no symmetry or decoration, just rough figures carved unevenly, like whoever made them didn't care how they looked as long as they stayed. Up close, the age of them was unmistakable. The lines were worn thin and rounded by time, with mineral deposits growing through the carvings themselves. "These are old," I said. Paul frowned. "How old?" "Old enough that they weren't meant to still be here." Kenneth angled his light lower. "Calcite like this takes centuries," he said quietly, "and it's cutting through the drawings. That means the carvings were here first." No one joked after that. The figures repeated along the tunnel, tall shapes with bent limbs and smaller ones clustered around them, always facing inward, like an audience. Then I noticed the discoloration. Not fresh, not even dark anymore. Just old brown smears worked into the grooves. Blood. One figure was drawn on its knees. Another showed something being held down. Arms pulled back, head forced upward, with a taller shape looming above it, its head scraping the stone ceiling. Paul swallowed. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Further in, the drawings changed. The smaller figures disappeared and were replaced by piles of bodies stacked unnaturally, limbs tangled together, while the tall figure remained above them, drawn again and again, always watching. The carvings read like records. Kenneth stepped back. It felt like maintenance. That was the moment. The cave stopped feeling passive. The air thickened, and our lights didn't reach as far anymore. Shadows clung to the walls instead of pulling back. And when we stood still and listened, every sound came back delayed, as if the cave was deciding whether to return it. Paul shifted his weight, and the scrape of his boot came back wrong, stretched and distorted. "I don't like this," he said quietly. No one argued. Stone shifted behind us, slow and controlled, not falling, not collapsing, moving. We turned our lights down the tunnel and saw nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. The cave felt occupied. The main light died without warning. It didn't flicker or dim. It was just gone, and darkness swallowed us before the backups kicked in, weaker and narrower, making the tunnel feel unfinished. Ahead, at the bend, something blocked the light. A shape too tall for the space it stood in. Only a very tall and unnatural silhouette was able to be seen with the dim light. It didn't move. Then, in a blink of an eye, it wasn't there anymore. "Who's there?" Kenneth screamed with noticeable fear. This unexplainable primal fear filled our bodies, and we ran. The tunnel warped at speed. Turns came too quickly, passages stretched longer than memory allowed, and our lights carved frantic shapes into the walls as the air grew warmer and heavier in our lungs. Paul stumbled once, then he looked back. He screamed, not loud, not long, just enough to tell us something was very wrong. We ran harder, legs burning, lungs tearing, the exit feeling withheld, until daylight finally tore through the darkness. We burst out of the cave and didn't stop. We didn't look back or speak, sprinting until our lungs gave out and then scrambling to the car, hands shaking, keys dropped, doors slammed. The engine started, and we were gone before the cave could finish being behind us. Paul didn't talk about what he saw right away. Instead, he started researching old journals, regional records, mentions of tribes that never made it into official history. He found fragments about a people who believed the land itself could house something older than them. Not a spirit, not an ancestor, something that didn't arrive, something that was already there. They believed it was a god, but not one that listened or answered prayers. It didn't demand worship or offer protection. It simply existed. The sacrifices weren't meant to please it. They were meant to keep it still. Paul said the cave wasn't a dwelling. It was a boundary. He stopped researching after that. A week later, he called me late and said only one thing. I shouldn't have looked. Paul told me the thing looked uncanny, too tall and too thin. Skin that looked like a wet suit covering its thin limbs, and that the tunnel bent around it like space itself didn't matter. The way it moved was wrong. Moving forward without effort, the way it moved was unnatural. Like joint that had a mind of its own scraping, its head on the tall ceiling of the cave with every step. Then he paused. The eyes, he said, or where they should have been. He said there were empty spaces in its face. Not holes or shadows, just absence, like something essential had been removed and reality hadn't bothered to correct it. Paul went first. He stopped sleeping, started measuring rooms without realizing it, and said the world felt poorly assembled once you noticed the gaps. They found him standing in his shower, water still running, eyes open, no injuries. The coroner said, heart failure. Kenneth lasted longer. He joked, went back to work, and said caves mess with your head if you let them. The last thing he asked me was whether places could remember people, and that he was really scared. They found him on his apartment balcony a week later. The door locked from the inside, footprints leading to the railing, and nowhere else. I'm the last one left now. That's why I'm recording this. Sometimes, when I stand still in the dark, I get the feeling that something underground is perfectly still too, remembering the exact way we moved. If you find this, don't look for the cave. If you hear about an unmapped system or see markings that stop abruptly, leave. And don't mistake getting out for being safe. Whatever is down there doesn't need to trap you. It only needs you to know it exists. Please, help me